started, I had two questions about the activity. The only thing that seems to have happened to a few of you is, remember, if you're going to get, say, the confidence interval around correlation, you need to be sure and run that line that says library psychometric, because that loads the package. Other than that, a few of you can put stuff in over there, that's great. I remind you that I had in-person office hours outside of 106, psychology building. And in-person things you need, that's fine. I'll try to bring them on the laptop for myself. Well, when last we were talking about survey responses and gathering data and evaluating it, we were talking a little bit about consumer products. And the reason I wanted to foster a bit of conversation on that, and I'll do my best to recall what that is, because for some odd reason, the Zoom on Friday's class did not record. But we're talking about the fact that the people who give ratings may not be typical of the consumer. The consumers who are rating may not be like you. People might only rate when they have a really extreme experience, like the vendor went above and beyond the call of duty to get your product. Or on the other hand, it was so terribly horrible. This is an opportunity to tie in with what we had before when we were talking about heuristics and why your opinions might color the consumer ratings that we see on places like Yelp or Amazon. So do any of these other topics come up for you as reasons that you might not want to just go in and check out the products that have the 5-star ratings? Just talk, it's fine.
I would say availability heuristic, because you're seeing like just like the first great item and then not really like researching it at all.
And people who bought this item also looked at might be the same thing. So if everybody's doing that, that actually be the best thing. More?
I think we may have talked about it last week, but there's no like comparison or control group for these kinds of reviews.
True. Anything else coming on? It's a lot of voting, isn't it? The reason that marketers hire influencers. I have a friend of mine who's strangely enough from my generation. And they're paid to chat up and talk about things. We increase the number of navigations to the company's website. So obviously, if you're standing around thinking about something to buy, just trying to move this in for my garment, how are you supposed to use those? Or what ways could you use those star things to produce useful information for your purpose? To clue a little bit, you have a theory that you want to buy, say, a fitness watch. Buy and if we go back to kind of the first lectures I had, when you're a scientist and you have a theory, what kind of information are you supposed to gather?
Empirical data.
Empirical data, that's true. But say we're looking at our stars. I got a theory. Sir Karl Popper would tell me what to do what with my theory.
Test it.
Yeah, just do a hard test. How did I falsify it? So thinking of buying a phone, yeah, the 5-star reviews are going to come up on the top because that's going to tell me, you know, all the encouragements to buy this thing. Inside this, you know, in Amazon, you can also say, show me the 1-star reviews. And those users will say, well, it's a nice thing, but there's some problems that I had in mind, like the delivery and so forth. Whole story I had was, a few years ago, there was when the university was a little more flush with money, they had a wellness initiative, and they were going to have all the staff and faculty and students buy Fitbits and run and do these types of things. And I got mine. I bought it mainly unreflected because everybody else was doing it. This was the program. But I didn't pay attention to the problems. And pretty soon I was outside running and a thunderstorm came and it got wet. Flickered out and went out. I thought, oh, well, that's just one bad thing. Oops, it kind of went past the warranty. So I got another one. That one lasted 6 months and so forth. I later found out that that particular product is really prone to this kind of dying. And the company actually kind of plans that you're going to be buying a new Fitbit every year, unless you're just maintenance, which is kind of extortionate. Garmin's on the other hand for several years. And that criticism comes up if you look at the 1-star reviews. Similarly, if you're in a restaurant, looking at your 1-star Yelp reviews, well, A, are they recent? Have they fixed the problem that was identified? And B, are the types of things they're talking about things that are important? There is a certain amount of faking that goes on in reviews. Sometimes people will pay, companies will pay people to provide really good reviews. Sometimes the people reviewing the product back in the days on some platforms have not even actually bought the product. So places like Amazon now say verified purchaser. Another alternative to doing survey measurement inside of psychology is to actually do behavioral assessment. People who are anthropologists, people who are ethnographers do a great deal of observation. And if you get to know some anthropologists or ethnographers, you'll find that they don't think much of psychology's approach to observation, because it takes years to learn to be an anthropologist and not contaminate the society you are observing or the community you are observing with your own biases, and also to attend to the things. But inside of psychology, behavioral observation is frequently very useful. I mentioned in the last lecture on Friday that it's really useful because it gives you rich data. You can spend some time to talk with people in an interview situation, or you can actually watch what people do. It was a nice study, somewhat old, Hartshorne and May's study of dishonesty. And I thought it was the really coolest study I'd ever seen, because it was a study of who is going to cheat under what conditions. And they would do things like have people fill out a test, and then they had little subtle ways to see if people were changing their answers. They would give the test out, have people grade it, and hand it back in. But unbeknownst to them, there was actually something about the test form that showed the answer that was there. They also had observers. This is kind of before video was quite so popular. Watch to see who would actually go up to the teacher's desk and steal things. And the pocket theories that Hartshorne and May had was that morality was itself perhaps a structured thing. And the conclusion of that study was, no, actually, no. It's very hard to tell who was going to cheat, who was going to do something immoral in a school setting. And it's not only the kids who are in trouble doing it. I have a sad personal story. First time it's happened to me in my 31 years of teaching at Missouri. I had a wonderful doctoral presentation for Comp's defense, beautiful PowerPoint, very nice young man. And we basically had kind of a love fest of just saying, oh, gee, you really did a nice job. This is great. We asked a few questions to show that, we read the thing. And we all signed up and I felt very good about it. 2 weeks later, I got a note from the chair. On reflection, when we were looking at the presentation, we looked at some of the data and we thought these tables are almost too good to be true. And the note said, as a result, the department conducted an investigation and they determined that the data were fake. Therefore, you need to sign this form to revoke the passing grade on the comps, and this person has left the program. And I thought, oh gosh, because in terms of halo effect, this was a young person, had no reason to cheat, and now they're expelled from the program. The few times where I've had to deal with academic dishonesty in my classes I teach, they're in statistics, it's not the failing students who cheat. It's the ones who, oh, I've always had A's, and this is the only way I can keep on getting them. And it's super disappointing to me because generally speaking, as I hope you realize, I'm a fairly merciful person and make accommodations, and I'm more than willing to go the extra mile, doing office hours, private tutoring, whatever it takes to get people through. So there is no way to judge people, and you should be careful of judging them. The example in the book is kind of a fun one because there is this stereotype that, women are chatty and men don't talk as much. And if you actually observe the number of words that people say, this relationship does not hold throughout the day. You used a thing called an ear. It's a little device that you wear around your neck like a necklace. And every time you speak, it activates. Tim Troll in our department does studies of borderline clients and community clients and keeps track of how they are. And it records what you say. And in his particular situation, he's interested in coding the emotional content of this because some borderline people do absolutely amazing things that are kind of scary to me. They'll be incredibly happy 1 minute, and within the short span of 20 minutes, they're just in absolute despair and depression. And then 20 minutes later, oh, everything's fine. Okay. So looking at, Tim looks at that because what he's interested in doing is finding out if there are different flavors of borderline personality disorder. Some people go into, that's this person who rapidly cycles is, unregulated in their emotions, but it seems like the highs and the lows happen really, really quickly. Other people seem to have a much longer cycle, maybe a day, maybe a couple of days. And it might be the case that, there's no one thing called borderline personality disorder. It's maybe a little bit like arthritis. There really is no one thing called arthritis. There's a whole bunch of varieties of flavors of arthritis that happen. If you ever, I don't know if they do it anymore, but the Shriners used to have a circus and their promotion was for kids with arthritis. And you can always have lots of people with arthritis. MU has a very strong arthritis program. And there are these kids who really, really feel sorry for them. They're very brittle and very frail. By contrast, Jerry Lewis with the Muscular Dystrophy Association and their fundraising, they have trouble actually having people at events because you can't find that many kids with MMA. That's not to say that that mystery makes it less, it's just that it's a lot less common. So inside of this, across repeated studies, if we're looking at a variety of people who are largely young, at least from my perspective, here's our average number of words spoken. It might amuse you to know that some of the people here on campus, anthropology and evolutionary psychology, do tend to think that women speak more than men under certain situations, that women are much more likely to network. I think that this says much more about child rearing responsibilities in the United States culture than it says evolutionary differences in men and women, because it's the women who are having to take care of the kids, generally speaking, help to pick out the schools, attend the parent-teacher conferences, and so forth. So that's, you might think behavioral observation is a really nice thing. It's certainly better than surveys for a couple of reasons. They're not going to show you a pretty picture of themselves. They're not going to fence sit. They're not going to have all of these response biases that we just got done talking about prior to this. Behavioral observation, though, is not the goal path to happiness. This is the second example. I'll get to the problems on another slide. I forgot this one comes up. Where they're looking at observations and then observations in a particular time of day and what exactly is going on with that. So it's a little bit of a refinement where we're just counting how many words you have. They're trying to talk about what are you actually talking about. Certainly relate as a parent to the issue of the topics, particularly around the supper table. This is what we're doing. Some parents go into negotiation and, no, we have to do something, we have to do something. It has never happened in my life that anyone has starved. So I just keep presenting food and the kitchen's closed for the evening. But here's what they talked about in terms of their family observation is interesting. Think to your own lives. Sometimes families get together and they want to remember something. How old is Grandpa, who's not here? Or when did that actually happen? Does your family sit down and think, well, now we're all going to get together and think about it? John Hooray was a British person, and he, of course, has this impressive Oxford British accent. He talks about it. Usually, inside of the family, if you're remembering things, everybody has a role to play. He was talking about a Scottish family. And he said, yes, in this family, the daughter-in-law had a role. She would propose what was remembered. And everyone else in the family agreed that whatever the daughter-in-law said was wrong. And that was her mission in life. Somebody in the family has memorial rights. Somebody gets to pronounce it. In this particular Scottish family, it was the mother who had memorial rights to say how things were in the past. And she delivered her pronouncement, usually at the kitchen sink, with her hand on her hip. And said, this is how it is. And that's how the family remembered things. Well, that interplay of the family is something that you're only going to get at if you actually watch the family doing its thing. So while this strategy is kind of nice, they're counting the behaviors, they had an idea of what they're going to look at, but the actual act of observing and thinking about how these people are performing is itself a way to generate theories. Does that make it science? Well, not yet, no. If you think back to Chapter 1, Whewell's hypothetico-inductive spiral, that generation of the theory is on the inductive arm. I'm doing some observations, and that's going to generate a theory for me. Given that theory, maybe I can do an experiment. Maybe I can talk about intervening in the family. Maybe I can say, oh, hey, Mom, this time maybe don't. Let's see what happens. Maybe my theory is right. Maybe it isn't. So if you're doing observations, it is important that those observations be reliable and that they be valid. Well, reliability is kind of fun. reliability is pretty easy for a math nerd. And we correlate how well one observer's numbers relate to another observer's numbers if they are continuous. If I do, to tie in the words here, I'm going to be using the intra-class correlation coefficient or coefficient alpha between my readers. Maybe what I'm looking at is a categorical variable. So in terms of school kids, violent outbursts are something that we code as present or absent. We could code them as continuous depending on how much damage the kid does, but it's categorical. Well, if that's the case, what statistic are we going to use? Not coefficient alpha, but sorry, people, I'll give you a hint, it's a Greek letter.
Beta?
What?
Beta?
Not yet, no.
Kappa?
Sorry, what?
Kappa?
Yes, kappa. Kappa is that measure that's a measure of agreement rate corrected for chance. Valid observations are another thing. Now, here's where, observations are influenced by culture and the expectations of the interview. I may have shared with you that when I went to kindergarten, I immediately ran afoul of the teacher. Because it was an oppositional child. And the reason I was an oppositional child is because I seemed to do whatever the teacher wanted, but I never said anything to her. And when called on to answer things, I never answered. It's because I didn't speak English. I could understand English, but I can't speak it. And that's not, that unusual. When I was growing up in grade school, our first task was to figure out all the different languages we had because we were the children of the Second World War. And I had a few representatives. There were like 3 other kids who were Germans. There was one kid who was Polish, was Bruce, and it was really sad because he didn't speak Polish and nobody else spoke Polish except his family. So I always have kind of this view of Polish people as very sad. But, it's just sort of me. The issue, though, that I want to drive home, though, is the teacher's theory about why children do something was biased because they didn't take into account the fact that there are other reasons going on. There's something the book doesn't talk about is the Pygmalion effect. Anybody in the theater? Who's Pygmalion? Or Greek mythology? No? Oh, it's a beautiful story. It's kind of like artificial intelligence. Pygmalion was a sculptor and a darn good one. And one day he produced a sculpture of a woman that was so beautiful that it became alive. So if you ever watch the musical My Fair Lady or the play Pygmalion, it's the story of Henry Higgins, who takes someone up off the street, a Cockney woman, and tries to make her into a cultured lady, and in the process falls in love with her. The play, by the way, has a sad ending. My Fair Lady has a happy ending, but that's Disney for you. Or Disney with somebody else. But the thinking being that in education, teacher expectations play a great role in how students do. That's why I think you're all so smart. Studies have shown that if you throw elementary teachers into a classroom and you tell the teachers, these people are promising based on their academic test score results, and other teachers you don't give that information to, the children who were told that the students were gifted actually end up doing better. And it calls forth the behavior. Maybe the teacher has just a little more patience explaining things, or a little more of an expectation, or prompts, or smiles, or supports. But that effect has its role. For psychological research, back in the day, the book talks about the Rosenthal study. And that's a study of rats and graduate students, not in that order. that in particular, which you probably have read in the book, Rosenthal told the graduate students, some of them, that, these rats are gifted and highly intelligent. And these rats are, well, they're rats, what can you say? It's in the text. Yeah, he found that, yes, indeed, these rats also, supposedly gifted rats, were also doing darn well better. But as he looked at what the graduate students were doing and the lab assistants, they were cheating, basically, because they would put the rats into a maze, and time to time the rats could go through the maze, and the gifted rats, they kind of poke them, give them a little nudge in the correct direction. Or they would do other things like talk and engage in all kinds of other behaviors that will influence the performance. The observers have a bias. You are observers. You are observers of me. There are certain assumptions you have about an old white person standing in front of you. It's rather amusing to hear some of those stories. They think, oh, we've had a life of privilege. Didn't have a toilet growing up. In an outhouse. Observer effects are defined as when the behavior confirms the observer's expectations. The Rosenthal effect. They're always digging up clever Hans, who was a horse in Berlin who could do math. And, the horse would indicate a correct answer here. This funny scribbling is Sutherland. It's the type of writing that people had before the Nazi era. The Nazis kind of did away with Sutherland because they thought it was not modern enough, but that's another story. And the amazing thing about Clever Hans is you could ask a question like, what's 5 plus 8? And Hans would tap out 13 for you. This was what's going on. Well, this horse was not a mathematical genius. This horse was not that outstanding. The horse was very gifted at picking up on behavioral clues. And the owner, particularly, the horse was very good at reading the owner. The horse was also somewhat good at reading other people. We never figured out what happened to good old Clever Hans. There is a similar, there's a similar story in Missouri about the world's smartest dog. And I'll send that out to you as a link. It's also a dog that could pick racehorse outcomes, that could do all kinds of magical prognostications based on its behavior. And probably what was going on is that dogs being social animals, also pretty good at picking up on human cues. So how are you going to keep from having these types of effects? One way is to blind the observation. So in the work that I did with college students, and we did like college students and graduate students and professors, and we had our transcripts, is we would remove the voice and we would remove the pictures of the people we interviewed and just have a transcript. Rate the arguments, please. And that's one thing, because if people see an old person saying things, maybe they'll weight it differently than a freshman. You also need to have very clear descriptions of exactly the behaviors that we're looking at. The more you can make those concrete, observable behaviors when you're observing, the better things. And as you can see in this particular little example, they talk about the types of coding they do, their operational definitions of what's going on, and they define their variables, and they come downstairs and they talk about the reliability on each of the conditions. With ICCs are fairly good. The other problem is that when you're rating people, the very act of observing people affects them. So This is becoming less of an issue than it was, because back in the day, video cameras were really big, cumbersome things, and you have this tripod thing in the corner. Now, however, the problems with observers are having the observer in the room observing is somewhat reactive. The class behaves differently if there is some person wearing a suit with clipboard in the back, or some older person holding up their phone and recording things. You might see things that are not going to be typical. One way to do that is to use unobtrusive observations. If you go over to the psychology building, some of the labs are equipped with one-way mirrors. So you can observe over here and watch the behavior over there without them knowing it's you doing reading. Other times, it's not going to work to get to a one-way mirror. Or it's not going to work to actually do that type of observation. Another thing you can do is to wait it out. So this particularly works if you're looking at kindergartens and you have to do an in-person observation. If you're just there the first week or so, you don't gather data, you just sit there. And the kids get used to you and you're no big deal. The classroom behavior is probably going to be settling down to what it should be. Another possibility is to try to measure the behavior's results. So you can take a look at what's going on, do your measurement from day one, and then as that hopefully extinguishes over the course of time, you can assess how much of that is affecting you. Is it ethical to observe people? That's a big issue. People are generating data all the time. So, graduate student, the guy who's working on his PhD says he wants to analyze Twitter data. Do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy when you tweet something? Or is any random person okay with it? I served on the student conduct committee. I think it's rather unfortunate that the university does not tell you that the university has staff who have nothing better to do than Instagram and Facebook and search for images that contain the MU logo or contain references to Mizzou. And if you're doing something stupid and you say that you're doing it at Mizzou, you're going to get brought to the student conduct committee. You do not have permission, so their argument, to use the MU logo or the word Mizzou in a public forum in a way that damages the value of that product. So coming back to research here, if you're on campus and you're walking across campus and there is a photographer and they take a picture of you, that does not fall under FERPA. They can use your picture. And you do not have to sign a release because you do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy. And when you're looking, so similarly, if you're doing research in your psychology research project, yes, you will go to the Human Subjects Committee, and yes, you will say what you plan to do. But generally speaking, the behaviors that you observe in adults in public does not have a reasonable expectation of privacy. Different song, second verse for if these people are in a restricted population, if they are children, if they're disabled, if they're in prison situations. If you go over to Loaves and Fishes, by the way, you'll see me down there, fourth Sunday of every month. You don't take pictures of homeless people in this situation because they are a disadvantaged population. You might go think about where this could actually damage people. What are some stories I've had here? Well, we had a graduate student who said that she wanted to interview prostitutes in Colombia about the clientele. Well, even if that individual signed a consent, they are revealing details about other people. What are the implications of that? Could you ruin a family by that? Or back in the day, before the internet became so ubiquitous, is it okay to take pictures of men leaving an adult bookstore? Use those in research. Back in the day, people used to do this. Some of the early people doing sex research would watch people leaving a bookstore and note their license plate that they came from to see how far away they lived, and then follow the cars it left to go back to the home, saying, is there evidence of, say, religious belief by the presence of a Virgin Mary or the religious certificate in front of the house? How, what's the income level of the house and so forth? And that type of description was what they used to document the but, these people have a reasonable expectation of privacy. What are the implications? Are you being beneficent? And how you communicate that work? It needs to be thought through. So as you're talking about these things, I mean, what you're expected on the test and in your life next semester is when you're designing things, tick through the things that make a question a good or a bad question. Brevity is the soul of wit. Questions are not that great. Think about whether you want to allow a forced choice or things. Various things that we talked about. And although the chapter divides into survey questions and rating questions and the semantic differential and behavioral observations, each of these things have their strengths and also their problems. Behavioral observation is generally a lot more expensive, for example. So here are key terms. As I said before, this chapter is kind of sort of easy. Don't let that fool you though, but you have to be able to recognize these types of things in practice. So be able to, people you're working with, be able to talk through in words what the thing means, but also here's an example of a study. What is the problem? Match the type of problem. That working for you? Any questions about these terms? So this. In a few minutes, talk a little bit about the next chapter. We're looking at external validity. It's important to talk about how we can get valid information, because one of the things we talked about in frequency claims is those frequencies claims have to be generalizable to some kind of a population, and how are we going to go about soliciting that population? And as with so many things, there are a few ways of actually doing that, depending on how much you know about the population's characteristics and the behavior of that population. So, for example, sadly, Rich people are maybe less likely to tell you how much they make unless you pay them well for it. People who don't have as much money, not so much. And you might want to take that thing into account when you're designing your study. In the city of Columbia, for example, one of the things that hospitals spend a great deal of money on is figuring out where to site a health center. And they do that with some information that's publicly available. They go over to the records and they find out how much all the houses in the area cost. But they also want to have information, and actually from that, and other websites, you can get how old the people are that are living in there, and how many children are there, and how those children relate to the various schools. And it also becomes necessary to get some information on the individuals. So armed with the information of income and age and family composition, you can then go in and start targeting families and be sure to get enough people in those various categories. For example. Generalizability is the question of to what extent was this going to generalize to some population of people. Here at Mizzou, we spent a lot of National Institute of Health money, and we have a very good portrait of what you folks are in terms of problem behaviors and the things that contribute to problem behaviors. But when you're looking at external validity, it's important to know that it also is not the be all and end all. There is some merit in finding out if there's an association between a couple of constructs using a convenient sample or using even a limited, weird sample of we'll talk about when is a sample biased, what contributes to bias, and strategies for actually getting a randomized sample, probability sampling techniques or hierarchical designs. And sometimes you do settle for that unrepresentative sample. You get biased samples. Sometimes you do that because you want to show the effect. It would be really hard to do that with a random sample. So you might look at extreme groups of people extremely high or low on a variable and see if that allows you to identify some kind of association. A census is everybody. So a census is drawing all individuals. So talk about the fact that if you're going to be talking about something that is externally valid, if I can get an unbiased sample, that's kind of the goal here, and I can do that by using these strategies, I would kind of like to do a random sample. That's just drawing people in. A probability sample or a representative sample. Now, on the other little announcement, I did make the inquisitive for this chapter available. I'll see you on Wednesday, right?